And assalamu alaikum and welcome, and thank you for giving us a little bit of your time, whether you're watching us live or you're watching us later on in the evening. I'm Corey Saylor. I'm the Research and Advocacy Director with the Council on American Islamic Relations, and we're here today to talk about a new paper that CAIR just put out, Gaza, the Resurgence of Islamophobia in 2023. And I'll let my colleague and co-author introduce herself to you real quick.
Thanks, Corey. Hi, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Thanks for joining us. My name is Farah Hafifi, and I am the Research and Advocacy Coordinator at CAIR.
So it's a very difficult time at the moment. We recognize that what's filling all of our screens every day from Gaza is just horrifying. If you're seeing the breaking news, the Washington Post is reporting that the Israeli government's argument around Al-Shifa Hospital just doesn't hold up to the Washington Post's investigation, at least. That's front and center on their website as we speak. But we also remember that in other areas, China, where the Uyghurs are being oppressed, India, where the Modi government is currently repressing Muslims, France, and other parts of Europe where Muslims are suffering through terrible situations. It's all difficult, but today we're going to focus on the United States for the most part, because when we say the resurgence of Islamophobia, we're talking about here in the United States, not worldwide. So what we're going to do, we'll jump in. We'll talk a little bit about some of the things that, as we each worked on the papers that struck us, then we'll take a step back and why did we write the paper? And then we'll kind of look forward, because the idea of the paper really is to look forward into next year. And, hopefully you will walk away understanding a little bit more when we say the resurgence of Islamophobia, what we're talking about. So, Farah, what I'd like to do is, can I ask you to just sort of start off with the top line numbers that we've been reporting before we even put this paper out, right? So when we talk about a resurgence of Islamophobia, like what's the numbers context?
Yep. So CAIR has decided to try to quantitatively assess the kinds of Islamophobic incidents that we know have been going on since October. So in our latest data collection, and what that involves is us collecting data from, areas where CAIR has a chapter office, we collected between October 7th and December 2nd. And that report found that we received over 2,100 complaints, including reported bias incidents directed towards Muslims in those 8 weeks. So to put that in context for you, Corey, that is 42% of the complaints that we received in the entire year of 2022. So in just 8 weeks, we've reached nearly 50% of the reports that we reached in an entire year. So we are certainly seeing that Islamophobia is spiraling out of control. And I want to say that over those 8 weeks as well, we did not see a decline. Instead, we're seeing very steady instances of anti-Muslim attacks across the country.
Each one of those numbers is a human being, right? And I think that's one of the important things. But staggering, 42% of all of the cases we got last year in a 57-day period. So when we say resurgence, I'm very comfortable that we are not overstating what's going on in the United States right now. So we put out this paper, Gaza, the Resurgence of Islamophobia in 2023. And, the paper is essentially an assessment of how what's going on in Gaza has re-illuminated a number of the different aspects of Islamophobia that have existed in the United States for a long time. And to give everybody a sense, and some of the things that we talk about in the paper, unfortunately, one of the things that stuck out to me while I was working on my part of the research was how both Democrats and Republicans have deployed anti-Muslim tropes, anti-Arab tropes over the last few weeks. So President Biden, with his comment about you can't trust Palestinian numbers, the old anti-Arab tropes that, or anti-Muslim tropes that somehow were less trustworthy than other people, even though the State Department's been using those numbers without question for a long time. The UN has confirmed that they essentially align with what the UN understands to be it's the numbers. Congressman Brian Mast from Florida, a Republican, on the floor of the U.S. House, essentially saying there are no Palestinian civilians and justifying genocide against that population. And it's worth noting, not in the paper because it just happened last night and it's coming out today, but former Republican member of Congress Michelle Bachmann, known for her Islamophobic rhetoric, similarly has said that called for cleansing in Gaza. So very problematic speech there. One more example, Farah, is John Kirby with the White House, who is on video choking up when he was talking about Ukrainian civilians a few months ago. But when he was asked about Palestinian civilians, essentially, that's war, right? So the differences we hear, the dehumanization that we hear coming from our government, it troubles me a lot. And so that was one of the parts of our paper that really stuck out to me. And I'd like to put that to you. Can you give us a sense of something that really stuck out to you as you were working on the paper?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that, Corey. I think what I also want to point out in those examples that you brought up is, as you mentioned, the Islamophobia, the anti-Muslim sentiment that undergirds those kinds of statements. The idea, that's promoted in President Biden's, questioning of Palestinian claims, the idea that Muslims and Arabs and Palestinians are untrustworthy sources of information, right? Which is a common Islamophobic trope. Or the idea in Representative Bachmann's remarks when she, referred to Palestinians in Gaza as, quote, potential mercenaries, unquote. That is also an Islamophobic trope. The idea that Muslims are inherently violent, are inherently suspicious. So there's a way that these tropes that have been around for quite some time, right? We know that they didn't, these didn't emerge in October. Many people who are observing the situation over the last several decades know that these kinds of ideas did not emerge in October. But the way that they're becoming normalized as possible things to say in public by, sitting officials and former sitting officials, that is the really concerning part. And what it directly leads to, and what it contributes to is the fact that this kind of speech is seen as permissible also by everyday people on social media networks. So I'll discuss something that I found really interesting as I was conducting this research is the role of social media networks in failing to check this kind of hateful speech, this kind of disinformation about Muslims, Arabs, and Palestinians, and also two, their role in actively censoring Palestinian voices. So to give you an example of the first one, we see that, for example, a report came out by The Intercept that Facebook had allowed an ad that called for the assassination of a pro-Palestinian activist to be put on its platform. And they even, they responded to the report. They admitted that should not have been approved, I believe, according to the report. And then in that same report, we also see that a series of ads were sent into Facebook just to test, its ability to check for hate speech and advertisements. And apparently the platform had also approved ads that, refer to children in Gaza as, quote, future terrorists, unquote, and also refer to Arabs as, quote, pigs. So these kinds of platforms we see are clearly failing to prevent the types of hateful speech that's being directed towards Arabs, Muslims, and Palestinians. But it also seems that there is a priority at some of these platforms to potentially systemically repress Palestinian voices. So a report came out in the Wall Street Journal a few months ago now that Meta had lowered the threshold for determining hate speech coming out, or in hate speech in posts coming out of specifically the Palestinian territory. So essentially they determined, to put it in brief terms, that if the system was even 25% certain that a post coming out of Palestine was hate speech, that post was censored. To give you some context, for those posts in Israel, that threshold was 40%. So what we're seeing is, potential systemic targeting of Palestinian voices that are attempting to call attention to the human rights crisis in Gaza. So that is an incredibly shocking element that I saw come out. But I also want to pitch it back to you, because I also know, Corey, that these social media platforms have also become spaces for doxing, for cyberbullying. And so I was wondering if you could tell us more about what we're seeing in terms of doxing, aka the specific cyber targeting of individuals by sharing their personal information online.
Yeah, it's one of those things in any wave of Islamophobia, and this is the biggest one we've seen since Donald Trump announced his plan to ban Muslims from the United States back in December 2015. In any one of these waves, you get, back to your 2,171, a lot of bias, right? There's also in this wave a couple of standout patterns that we just haven't seen before. And one of those is the very specific targeting of students at the particularly the university level. And there's a couple of parts to that I would want people to understand. And it starts, as you rightly point out, with the doxing. So very early on, what we saw was digital trucks driving around at Harvard. We've also seen them at Columbia University with pictures and the names of students who had spoken up on behalf of Palestinian humanity. We've seen mass doxing Google Sheets where there were lists with hundreds of students or dozens of students, depending on the list, names and personally identifiable information. And all of that is done in an attempt to intimidate people and silence them. And, you got to give a credit to a lot of the students at universities that we have spoken to over the last couple of months who, they're not going to be silenced by that. But to recognize that that's being done at a level that we've never seen before is just part of why we did this paper. You've got to understand what the larger patterns are as you absorb the daily horrors in the news. Another thing, in terms of targeting students, you got to look at what Ron DeSantis did, where he said he was going to actually shut down affiliates of one student organization in his state. That, to our knowledge, has not at this point in time happened, despite him saying that. As a matter of fact, one of his own employees of the Florida government said, they weren't going to do it. So we'll see where that goes. But, how these are supposed to be the bastions of free speech. And essentially what we're telling the next generation of political activists is to shut up, which, is highly problematic. And to add to that pattern, the Anti-Defamation League sent out a letter to universities across the country suggesting that the administration at those universities investigate a student group without any evidence that those student groups at those particular campuses had done anything wrong whatsoever. So this decision to attempt to silence people by unknown individuals hiding behind their efforts to dox, like the Google Sheets, or the actual sort of institutions who should be calling for the protection of free speech, attempting to get investigations by the powers that be into people for simply speaking up about their political beliefs. It's a very difficult environment for students. And, I will add that, in terms of people trying to suppress speech, one other point, and we'll wrap on this in just a second. I do want to hear sort of one more item from you in terms of what you saw in our work that made it into the paper, right? Because obviously government officials speaking out, social media platforms, students being targeted, all of that's in the paper. One other thing that stuck out to me is the way that, there was a piece in the Atlantic that noted that about 2/3 of the social media posts coming out, spreading disinformation about what's going on in Gaza were originating from India. And one of the reasons for that is the government of Narendra Modi, who is a Hindutva nationalist who's been engaged in suppressing Muslims for years now. As a matter of fact, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom has called multiple times for India to be designated as what's known a country of particular concern. because of their engaging in suppressing religious minorities, not just Muslims, but others. But for the moment, we're focusing on Muslims, that people there will support, and the government there will support what we're seeing in Gaza by way of justifying what they're doing in their own country. That was just one of those things that as we were working on the paper, it's not only is there the horror that's going on in Gaza, but then you have other governments trying to take advantage of that horror to advance the horrific things they're trying to do in their own countries. So that's, one of those, we wrote that and it stuck with me, right? It's hard to get that thought out of your mind. Anything else that you want to give viewers, from what you wrote and what you researched that's in the paper?
Yeah. Thank you for that, Corey. I want to run it back to the doxing portion of the conversation, because I think you made excellent points about how students are being doxed online, how administrators at institutions of higher education are, failing to protect them and also, seem to potentially be targeting them. But I also want to point out that employees, in a very, I think, again, unprecedented trend for where we are right now, are also being doxxed, are also experiencing cyberbullying. So back in October, we also saw reports of websites specifically dedicated to doxing individuals who had, posted something about Palestine, posted for Palestinian human rights. And these sites, according to a New York Times article, claimed that they were simply calling out people who were promoting violence. But according to that same article, the New York Times actually investigated and found that many people on this list of thousands of employees whose personal information was put online were simply calling for humanitarian aid for Palestinian civilians in Gaza. They were using the hashtag Gaza under attack to attempt to call attention to the human rights abuses that the Israeli government is currently undertaking against Palestinian civilians in Gaza. So I think there's also this interesting trend of people, who are supporting Palestinian human rights, who are critiquing Israeli state policy of, being confused as people who are potentially, or conflated with people who are potentially promoting violence. And that has real consequences on their employment, on their ability to feel safe at work. We've seen, I know internally at CAIR, we've seen dozens of reports come in related to employment, related to people potentially being fired or facing discrimination at their place of work because of the fact that they might be posting things online that are supporting Palestinian human rights. So I also want to point that out in particular. I know, for example, this did not make it in the report, but I believe last week, our legal team filed a complaint on behalf of a teacher, an instructor who posted something in support of Palestinian human rights in her email signature, even though many other teachers at that school had posted similar things in their signature related to other matters, and she faced repercussions. So these incidents are real. These are real people. They're not just numbers. And due to actions by individuals who are seeking to publicly embarrass people who are really just supporting human rights, they are facing real consequences to their future. So with that being, sorry, Corey. With that being said, I just wanted to go ahead and pitch it back to you, actually, because I mean, we've discussed so much. We've seen that there are so many concerning trends and patterns, and I want to pitch it back to you to help us understand a little bit more about what this paper hopes to do for our future.
Yeah, we were talking about this paper back in January, like when we did our planning for this year. The idea was that since President Trump left office, the nature of Islamophobia in the United States, I believe, has changed. And I rest that argument on a couple of different things. But one of the primary points that's worth people understanding is that the people driving anti-Muslim sentiment have changed. We just talked about the U.S. government. Like I think we can make an argument. Well, I know we can make an argument that the U.S. government has been a driver of anti-Muslim sentiment for quite some time. But in the past, when CAIR was putting together our Islamophobia reports, we often focused on the US Islamophobia Network. And this is a collection of organizations who deploy anti-Muslim stereotypes as a routine part of their business. And we've documented millions and millions of dollars going into this anti-Muslim network so that they could go out and do things like try to pass legislation that specifically targets Muslims for different treatment in the United States, so that they could go out and spread disinformation and stereotypes about Muslims. And yet, since Biden left office, these groups just haven't had the impact that they once did. And I'll talk about a couple just quickly because, we live this stuff. The people watching us right now don't. So I want to give you a bit of a, our viewers a bit of a window into what we're talking about. Act for America used to be one of the most effective anti-Muslim groups in the country, right? I mean, that's been written about them, not just by us, but on the Georgetown Bridge Initiative does a very good overview of the organization. Chapters all across the country pushing anti-Muslim legislation, generally fostering stereotypes about Muslims. And yet, after Trump left office, what you see in Act for America founder Bridget Gabriel's, for instance, her Twitter feed, it suddenly became AI. Recently it's been AI generated images of President Trump and all kinds of other sort of things I can't quite wrap my head around why she would be posting these things, but it's all about praising President Trump and then talking about her boycott of the NFL. And when you look at Act for America's legislative victories that they had posted earlier this year, most of it was stuff centered around voter suppression, right? Making sure that not everybody can vote. And Bridget Gabriel's been very active in talking about raising the voter age because she thinks that people 18, 19, 20 years old aren't capable of the type of thought necessary to cast a vote, which just more about that targeting of university level students, right? Very problematic stuff, but just the focus was gone, right? It's not about bashing on Muslims anymore. So after Gaza happens, all of a sudden, Bridget Gabriel posts a video bringing up a long debunked stereotype about how Muslims are going to take over this country. And you have to ask, a few years ago, like that was what they talked about all the time, right? Muslims are going to take over, Muslims are going to take over, be afraid, be afraid, be afraid. Trump leaves office. Where did all that go? Like, did that, was that impending takeover just suddenly like not a thing anymore? Or was it not making money? Was it not getting you attention? I would argue that it just wasn't getting these groups the attention that the fear mongering used to generate. Because the same is very true for what's known as Understanding the Threat, or what used to be known. This was an organization founded by a former FBI agent, John Guandolo, and he would go around and teach law enforcement to just be terrified of people who are Muslims. And he closed Understanding the Threat down earlier this year. So these groups that used to be fairly influential, not so much. But a long explanation, I understand, but I want people to understand, right? We have to think about this stuff. If the Islamophobia is not what we were dealing with back in 2020 when Trump left office, we need to rethink about what's driving it, where it's coming from, and how do we approach it again. So that was why we initially came up with this paper idea. We incorporated the material about Gaza because same tropes, same stuff we've been seeing for years, new face, right? Are not even always new faces. And so I've talked a bit about the anti-Muslim network, but you in your research before you came to CAIR, the U.S. government, which is a primary driver of Islamophobia in the United States in my book, and I can certainly talk about it, but you go back even further than what the dates that people traditionally think is when the U.S. government became anti-Muslim. Let's give us a little bit about that.
Of course. Thank you for that, Corey. I think what I want to point out in what you just said is there is a way that even though Islamophobia changes and actors come and go, it seems to always snap back. You know, something happens, and then there's a moment when the same Islamophobic tropes, the same anti-Arab tropes that we thought we've come past, just come back into action. And they're used, as we mentioned, by a variety of actors, people that, you know, the Muslim community have traditionally considered allies, people that the Muslim, you know, people who have not been allies to the Muslim community. It kind of just becomes, you know, free for everyone to participate in. And so what I want to emphasize is, as you mentioned, these anti-Muslim tropes, these anti-Muslim ideas, the concept that Muslims are suspicious, prone to violence, untrustworthy. These did not originate now. These did not originate this year. These did not even originate at 9/11, when most people, you know, which is the moment that most people mark as the start of major Islamophobia, lots of Islamophobia. And that's not even quite true. I think what we've seen throughout the 20th century and prior research that I've done before, you know, continuing this work at CAIR, is that Muslims have been surveilled by law enforcement officials. Muslims have been targeted by prison officials throughout the 20th century and across the country. So the idea that Muslims are suspicious, untrustworthy, prone to violence, that we see right now in this current moment, underlacing all of these statements that political actors, social actors are making, these ideas, they are seem deeply rooted in American society. And I think this moment now more than ever just shows us just how clear that even when we think we're making progress, even if we thought we were making progress earlier this year, for example, before October, it just seems to be snapping back. So I think what this means for us as an organization, and really what it means for anybody who cares deeply about social justice, who cares about promoting mutual understanding, is that we need to maybe develop new tools, new ways of thinking about how we can address Islamophobia and how we can make it so that the Muslim community feels respected in this country, and not constantly victim to these same Islamophobic tropes. So what I'll do is I'll throw it back to you, Corey, to maybe start that conversation about what it is that we do, knowing how pervasive Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism is in this country.
Nice try, but it's going to come back to you pretty quickly. So I don't think you ignore the Islamophobia network. You just can't.
Yeah.
But I do think we have to, like, that can't be our narrow tunnel vision focus, because the Islamophobia network doesn't have the impact it once had. And we talked about the US government. You have the Muslim ban and the Africa ban, like, that was Republican driven. Under Obama, there were countering violent extremism programs, and I know most people don't know what that is, but, you know, to boil it down, it was essentially Muslims are more prone to violence than other groups of people, and therefore we need to provide additional resources to keep an eye on them. And it funded things like soccer leagues for Somali kids. So somehow Somali kids playing soccer is an anti-terrorism tool, whereas white kids in a suburban setting, it's just a leadership and a fun thing. So, you know, very strange thing, but Democrat driven, right? So you have to acknowledge that both parts of the, you know, both parties, have used deployed government to in various ways to disparage Muslims. But, you know, I said it was come back to you pretty quickly, because one of the things that we offer in the paper is a new measurement tool. And I want you to talk about that measurement tool. But before you do, I want our viewers to understand the reason you want to do that is because if we understand where anti-Muslim sentiment is the strongest, then groups like CAIR can target more resources toward fighting that kind of bias in different regions. So why don't you talk a little bit about one of the tools we're working on? I wouldn't call it developed yet. We're proposing and we'll be developing over the next year.
Yep. Thank you, Corey. So I think one of the things that this moment has shown us, but also something we've been thinking about, from my understanding at CAIR for some time, is figuring out quantitative methods to understand Islamophobia in the United States. So we have our qualitative methods for some time, we have our research methods, but at the same time, there's a way in which putting numbers, trying to understand Islamophobia quantitatively might help us not just account for these instances for our community, right? So that we can potentially request for resources to be allocated to support local Muslim communities across the country, but also so that US politicians, media networks understand the level of Islamophobic hate and rhetoric that we're talking about when we conduct our research. So one of the things that we're working towards, as you mentioned, not yet developed, but we're proposing is a state-specific quantitative tool to assess Islamophobia at the local level. So as a part of this paper, and you can see our findings online, we've developed different indicators that we think might help us understand if Islamophobia is accepted or rejected at the local level. So we have political indicators, for example, are Muslim concerns heard by US politicians? Are Muslims represented in political office? We also have educational indicators. Are teachers and administrators, for example, promoting false information about Islam and Muslims that could potentially be harmful? We might consider that an indication of whether Islamophobia is being accepted or rejected. So those are a few examples. Our indicators span political, social, educational, and legal levels in order for us to be able to develop a quantitative approach that would help us say to what extent is Islamophobia accepted in this state, and then to be able to provide those recommendations again to our local Muslim communities, but also to actors who are interested in uplifting and empowering Muslim communities across the country. So that's one of the tools that we're proposing. And again, you can see the findings in more detail in the paper. But now I also want to pass it back to you, Corey, to tell us more about the kinds of work or the kinds of ways that CAIR's work might be shifting in order to address the current moment in advance of our 2024 Islamophobia report, which is our annual Islamophobia report that'll be coming out next year.
Yeah, and I think this is sort of a good point for us to start wrapping up our conversation. The current moment. I led off the conversation at the top talking about Gaza, but recognizing that anyone who's looking at the problem on a larger scale recognizes that it's a major, Islamophobia is a major problem in a number of countries around the world right now. Islamophobia traditionally becomes more of a major problem in the United States around election cycles. So our colleague Dalia Mogahed over at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding years ago wrote a paper, and in it an article, and in it she points out how 2010, which is a while back at this point, folks who were around then may remember the whole issue around a Islamic cultural center in Lower Manhattan that was rebranded by the Islamophobia network as the Ground Zero Mosque, and that rebranding made its way into the midterm campaigns of many politicians. Right, that was a surge that was entirely related to an election cycle. So right now, this moment, we have Gaza as a major driver of Islamophobia. The presidential election cycle gets serious around about mid-January when the first primaries start happening. And I believe it's fair to say that most political observers right now are saying this is going to be a particularly chaotic election year. So if you're us and the community is kindly funding us to think about Islamophobia, it would be irresponsible of us to just focus on one aspect of it, right? So how is our work shifting and changing? Next year, we're going to have Gaza, we're going to have the presidential election cycle, and whatever else comes our way. And institutions will need to deal with that every day. But at the same time, we have to have a vision that lasts further out beyond that because ultimately, if we're just running around reacting to everything, we're not going to get anywhere, right? So CAIR always has a vision for where we want to go. What is going to be the endpoint? What is the result that we want from our counter-Islamophobia work? And what I will do is just invite people to go to the paper and look at the new. We've updated our vision there. We originally wrote one in 2011. We're updating it there. It gives a direction to our work. Where do we want to go? But I think for sure what you will see more of from CAIR and institutions like ours next year is broad outreach to politicians, to educators, and a number of other places to make sure that top of mind for many of them is that deploying Islamophobia, anti-Arab bigotry, anti-Semitism, racism, you name it, ethnic hate, 100% unacceptable. And that there are institutions like CAIR who will be watching for that. And if you decide to indulge in such bigotry and hatred, there are advocacy tactics to make sure that such voices aren't central to any conversation in the United States, right? Long-term problem we've had with racism in this country, with all kinds of hate. I mean, you name it. But there are voices that are going to keep an eye on that and make sure that it gets pushed to the fringes where it belongs and not centered in the policies of our country. So, I want to thank you very much for the effort you put into writing this paper. I want to thank everybody who took some time out to watch our conversation today, because we are paid to think about this stuff. You're showing us the courtesy of joining us and giving us some of your free time through the day. That's appreciated. And I would just end on the note that our work 100% relies on people like the folks watching this video, because when CAIR asks people to join us in an effort like reaching out to a corporation that's done something Islamophobic, or contacting elected officials, when thousands and thousands of people react to that, that's what makes a difference in the universe. That's what gets attention. And so, as we go into 2024, already in a difficult moment, we look forward to the opportunity to work with all of you to defeat anti-Muslim bigotry and all the other forms of bigotry that have plagued this country for a long time. Thank you very much for your time and watching us today, and I'm sure we'll be in touch with everybody soon.